right, I think we're ready to begin. Happy Tuesday, everyone. I'm Brianne Chidachimo from Allied Physicians Group. We'd like to thank you for joining us for the COVID vaccine webinar for children under 5 years old. A few items before we begin. If you have additional questions, there's a Q&A feature located at the bottom of the screen. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. Following the webinar, we'll send out a link to the presentation as well as some other useful resources and information on where you can find our experts. So again, thank you for joining us. And now I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Carrie Firestein from Allied Physicians Group, who will be leading us in the discussion this evening.
Thank you, Bree. I'm Carrie Firestein, Chief Executive Officer of Allied Physicians Group, practicing pediatrician in Plainview for 35 years, mother of 3 and grandmother of 1. When we started COVID, I was grandmother of none. So my grandson is now 28 months old, and I can't believe we are still doing this. When we started, he was this big, and now he's clearly asking me for cookies. So it's crazy that we're still doing this, but we are. COVID has not gone away, and it is not going away. It has changed, but it is still here. Fortunately, we're here to talk about vaccines for my grandchild, for that under 5-year-old group that really until now has not been able to protect themselves. The question that a lot of parents want to know is, at this point, given that COVID has changed, does this make sense for me? I've been waiting for it for so long, and now in some ways it seems anticlimactic. So we're going to answer those questions tonight and give you insight into how the studies were done and what COVID does look like in 2022. So I am going to let our wonderful panel introduce themselves, and we're going to go backwards by who's talking. So we're going to start with Dr. Levine.
Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Levine. I'm a pediatrician in White Plains, New York. I've been practicing for 29 years as of today, actually. And as Dr. Firestein said, dealing with COVID for the last 2+ years, and it's been an interesting ride.
Dr. Kreiner.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Robin Kreiner. I am an allergy immunologist with Strauss Allergy and Asthma under Allied Physicians. I've been practicing allergy for about 7 years. I'm a pediatrician in my prior training, and I have 3 kids, 9, 6, and 3. So I am in the height of it. And as a working mother, as a working physician, these last few years have been very stressful for many different reasons. And I hope you all enjoy tonight's presentation with all the information that we have gathered that is out there, and hope we can support any decision that you are trying to make.
And Dr. Levine. And by the way, it is no mistake that Levine, Dr. Eric and Dr. Rachel have their last names spelled the same way. So Rachel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Dr. Levine. I'm the daughter of Dr. Levine, and I am a virologist by training. I got my PhD last year in influenza, studying influenza virus, and I'm an RNA virologist by training. So my specialty is RNA viruses like influenza and coronavirus.
Yes, when we started these lectures, you were a PhD candidate.
I was.
You are now an official doctor.
Yes, at the forefront of science throughout these past 2 years.
Yeah, we do know a lot more than we did 2.5 years ago when all of this started.
We do know a lot more than we did, that's correct, but the science is still changing and we're learning more every day.
Bree, you want to start with the slides? There you go.
All right, so I'm going to kick us off with a quick recap about how mRNA vaccines work. So the M in mRNA stands for messenger. And this mRNA is the way our cells conduct messages. It's the way they send messages from the nucleus, or the control center of our cells, where all of our DNA is made, where all of our DNA is, into the rest of the cell to make proteins. And that's our hair, our nails, our skin, the enzymes we use to digest our food, things like that. So the way the vaccine works is that it is a message or mRNA that encodes the protein on the surface of coronavirus, or a spike. And that's wrapped up in a layer of fat called a lipid nanoparticle, and that's injected into our arm. And then the mRNA gets into our cell, and our cell knows exactly what to do. It makes proteins. It doesn't see this RNA as any different than the RNA that encodes our hair, our nails, our skin, the enzymes that we use to digest our food. So it makes little spike proteins and presents them on the surface of our cells. And our immune system is constantly surveilling, looking for invaders. And our immune system stops when it sees spike and says, hey, that's not a normal protein. And it goes to work making antibodies, making T cells, making lots of other cells that mount an immune response. Next slide. So those antibodies and other immune cells stick around for the next time they see spike, which is either in another vaccine, in a booster, or in a real infection, to block the virus from replicating and causing disease. And the RNA that was injected is destroyed just like a Snapshot message. So it's gone within a day or so. And the spike proteins, they're gone within a day or so as well. So we've tricked the body into thinking that coronavirus is there, but it's not. And because it's not actually there, it can't cause damage, but we're left with the magic antibodies and T cells to protect ourselves. Next slide. So these vaccines have been an enormous success, but it didn't happen overnight. The technology for mRNA vaccines has been in the pipelines for decades. So scientists have been figuring out how to get the RNA into our cells, how to get the RNA to be expressed in our cells. All of these things have been figured out over the course of decades. We've given more than 10 billion COVID-19 vaccines worldwide. And in the United States, we have rigorous mechanisms to collect post-authorization data, and we have not seen any concerning safety signals in these mRNA vaccines. It's estimated in the past year that we have saved 20 million lives because of these vaccines globally. So that is a huge amount and speaks to the testament of these vaccines. Next slide. So let's talk about vaccine efficacy. And I want to go over this definition just so that we are all on the same page. So when we say vaccine efficacy, or we hear vaccine efficacy in the news, we're talking about efficacy against symptomatic illness. Vaccine efficacy against severe illness, hospitalization, and death really can't be measured in these clinical trials because they don't have enough people in them. We know from experience and real-world data that these vaccines are extremely protective against severe illness, hospitalization, and death, even from Omicron. And it's very likely that will hold true for children as well. So we say we vaccinate to prevent the worst. So a COVID-19 infection that results in mild symptoms means the vaccine is doing its job. Next slide. So let's go over the two separate trials in children 6 months to 5 years. So I'll start with Pfizer. So they enrolled about 4,500 children aged 6 months to under 5 years, and they were randomized 2 to 1. So 2 out of every 3 participants got the vaccine, and 1 out of every 3 participants got a placebo or salt water. And they got 1/10 of the adult dose, so 3 micrograms. And we know they released data a couple months ago showing there was a lack of efficacy against 2 doses. So they amended the study to include a 3rd dose. And that amended protocol had 1,500 children in it. So with that 3rd dose, we saw antibody levels that were similar to that of young adults. And in 6 months to 2 years, we had about a 75% efficacy. That was based off of 3 cases. And in the 2 to 4-year-old group, we had about an 82% efficacy based off of 7 cases. I am not taking too much stock in these hard efficacy percentages because they're based off of so few cases. I take more stock in the immunobridging, or that the antibody levels and the immune response is similar to that of young adults, that we know is protective. without that third dose, the trial failed immunobridging. So those children did not make enough neutralizing antibodies. And that's the reason why that third dose is there. In this trial, we saw a lower incidence of the classic reactogenicity symptoms than young adults. So that's, fever, headache, chills, fatigue, things that we know from as adults getting the vaccine that a lot of us have experienced after that second dose. There were no safety signals and no myocarditis observed. This study was likely not large enough to detect myocarditis, but we know from post-authorization data that the incidence of myocarditis tends to decrease drastically with age because they're getting less RNA. Next slide. So the big takeaway with the Pfizer vaccine for children under 5 is that they need 3 vaccines as part of the primary series. So they are not protected after those 2 doses. They definitely need that third. That third is not a booster with Pfizer for children under 5. It is part of the primary series. Next slide. So for Moderna, they enrolled about 6,500 children aged 6 months to 5 years, again, randomized 2-to-1 to receive 25 micrograms of the vaccine, which is a quarter of the adult dose. And these two doses produced antibody levels similar to that of young adults. And in 6 months to 2 years, we're getting efficacy about 50%. That's based on 85 cases. And in 2 years to 5 years, we see efficacy around 37%. Again, I tend not to focus too much on the hard percentage numbers. I focus more on the fact that they produced an immune response that we know is protective. And then again, we saw a lower incidence of reactogenicity than young adults. And again, no major safety signals and no myocarditis. Like with Pfizer, this trial is likely not large enough to detect myocarditis, but we know from post-authorization data that the incidence of myocarditis decreases drastically with age. And again, that's because we think they're getting less RNA, and that's why we're not seeing as much. Next slide. So these efficacy estimates, are hovering somewhere around 50%. And if we remember back when the first data on the adult trials was released, we were seeing efficacy percentages upwards of 90%. So this is really different, but it actually mimics that of adults in the real world. And this decreased efficacy against symptomatic illness is because of the hypertransmissibility of the Omicron variants. They're just so much more transmissible. And there's so much more virus out there because it's so transmissible. So we see with Omicron in adults, if we look at study 301 efficacy, RWE, which stands for real world efficacy, this is data coming from Moderna. We see that the vaccine efficacy against Omicron in the real world is hovering around 50%. And that's what we're seeing coming out of the clinical trials for children. So this decreased number is not something so much to worry about. It's what we see in adults as well. Next slide. So let's take a look at the primary series as a snapshot so we can compare. So on the top is Pfizer. This vaccine is trade named Comirnaty. So in 6 months to 4 years old, they're getting 3 doses. The first 2 doses are 3 weeks apart, and the second and third dose is 2 months apart. So it is going to take about 3 months for these children to be considered fully vaccinated. If you remember, we need to wait 2 weeks after that last dose to be considered fully vaccinated. So that's going to be about 3 months for children under 5 years who received Pfizer's vaccine. Again, we know with Pfizer, 5 to 11-year-olds are getting 1/3 of the adult dose, 2 doses about 3 weeks apart. And children 12 years and older and adults are getting 30 micrograms, 2 doses about 3 weeks apart. So if we go down to Moderna, their vaccine is trade name Spikevax. So for children 6 months to 5 years, they're getting 2 doses about 4 weeks apart. So they'll be fully vaccinated in about 6 weeks. So about a month and a half versus 3 months for Pfizer. Children 6 years to 11 years for Moderna are getting 2 doses of 50 micrograms about a month apart. And for children 12 years and older and adults, they're getting 100 micrograms, 2 doses about a month apart. So one thing that's come up in a lot of my conversations with other scientists is the drastically different doses that we see between Pfizer and Moderna. So an adult from Moderna is getting 100 micrograms, whereas an adult that got Pfizer is getting 30 micrograms. So these may seem like huge differences, but the RNAs that encode spike are a little bit different. They've modified them to be expressed in different ways. And the bubble of fat that surrounds the RNA or the lipid nanoparticle, that's composed of different fats. And some fats are more efficient at getting the RNA into cells and things like that. So I don't take too much stock in the fact that they're different, that the Pfizer and Moderna are different. We can't really compare them to each other. So it's not like a child that's getting Moderna is getting so much more RNA than a child that's getting Pfizer. Next slide. So what about boosters? And this seems to be a really hot topic. It's very likely that children will need a booster about 5 months after the primary series, regardless of whichever vaccine they got. Boosters for the fall are being updated to match Omicron. What is proposed for the fall is a bivalent vaccine. So one mRNA that encodes spike from the original virus, and another RNA that encodes Omicron from BA.4/5, which is the most recent Omicron subvariant. These clinical trials are being run now. What's going to happen as far as pediatric dosing and whether or not we're just going to scale down the dosing for whatever dose is decided for this bivalent vaccine for adults and scale down proportionally like we did with the original formulation is still really unclear. But when I listened in to the FDA meeting talking about updating boosters for the fall, there were a lot of high-level discussions about what's going to be done for pediatric vaccines. So it's definitely something that's being thought about. Despite the fact that the boosters are being updated to match Omicron, it is still recommended to get a primary series of the original formulation because we know this prevents severe outcomes. And one thing that's also being highlighted is that it's recommended that this upcoming fall and winter is going to be something of a transitional year. So Carrie talked about in the beginning how we're learning more about COVID-19 every day. So these vaccines may end up very similar to flu vaccines that are updated every year and a vaccine that we get every year around Halloween. We just don't know yet. It really depends on how much the virus continues to change. And this is something that scientists are actively following. And vaccine experts have emphasized that vaccines should induce a diverse repertoire of immune responses to maximize protection against potential variants. Next slide, although I think that's it. Yep, that's it for me.
All right, so again, I'm Robin Kreiner, and Rachel did a phenomenal job basically describing everything and all the necessary information. So I'm going to briefly touch on a few more things before Dr. Levine also goes. But when to vaccinate. So COVID-19 vaccination should be given regardless of prior history of infection. So many of you may be saying, well, my child already had it. I had it 3 months ago. I already got it twice. The clinical trials and the COVID vaccine experience thus far have really demonstrated the safety of the mRNA vaccines in people, even with history of prior COVID infection. And we've seen NOAA's flu as an example that we still continue to emphasize the importance of yearly flu vaccines to prevent complications, serious illness, and also protecting those around us. It's also noted that serologic testing, which means checking for your titers or your levels of antibody for previous COVID-19 infection, is not recommended prior to the vaccination because we really do not know those cutoff values for the vaccination. Slide. So what are the benefits for those 6 months to 4 years? So we have seen, based on studies, that young children are still at risk for severe COVID-19 infection. There are many children that have been hospitalized. Children with underlying medical conditions are at highest risk. Those that get infected with COVID-19 are at risk of multi-system inflammatory syndrome, which was super scary early on and still remains out there and an issue in those that become exposed to COVID-19. We also have many children that are still experiencing post-COVID conditions that have been reported, and we've seen that the vaccination can help decrease that risk. Also, one study showed that children under 18 who had COVID are actually up to 2.5 times more likely to be newly diagnosed with diabetes within 30 or more days after infection. So these vaccines are not out there to, just to give, but they really do show a benefit. Next slide. So the safety. So as Rachel said, a lot of people are, questioning, why am I going to give such a new vaccine to my child or even to myself? But these mRNA vaccines have been developed using science that has been around for decades. So it's really not a new thing. The science behind it is decades old. COVID-19 vaccines are safe, much safer than getting COVID-19 infection. And they're also very effective at preventing severe COVID-19 illness and limiting the spread of virus that cause it, especially to those around us, those unable to get it, or those immunocompromised. So some studies that we've seen from phase 2 and 3 trials of those in the 5 to 11-year-old group are very similar to the younger children. So many of the questions that came in prior were, what kind of side effects can I expect? So just like any other routine vaccine that has eradicated illness like polio, tetanus, and helped to prevent those infections, similar vaccine reactions happen with the COVID-19 vaccine as well. So local symptoms might include pain, swelling, or redness at the injection site. Sometimes those may manifest some fever, some fatigue, headache, or body aches. And that's just showing that the body is responding to the vaccine properly. And similar to, or even milder than those in older children, you may have these symptoms which are less, and even the dose is a little bit less. You also might have those rare adverse events like anaphylaxis, myocarditis, or pericarditis, inflammation around the heart. But as we've seen, the older individuals do get those a little bit more because of the amount of mRNA vaccine. And there was one study that showed there's about 5 cases of anaphylaxis per 1 million COVID-19 vaccines administered. And I have no doubt that we may see even less risk of anaphylaxis the more people that get it. So again, this is a very early on in the studies, and we may see things change, as we get more information and more studies and more participants.
Okay, all right. One is, you could probably see me smiling after listening to my child, and you can imagine our dinner conversations. Why should you vaccinate? Well, COVID vaccines help prevent disease, and they're very effective in reducing the risk of severe infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. For children under 5, there have been about 45,000 hospitalizations, and a quarter of those kids need ICU admissions. And there have been over 500 deaths just in children under 5. The interesting thing is that outcomes and who gets sick and who gets really sick is unpredictable. 64% of those under 5 had no underlying underlying medical problems. It's still, vaccines will help slow spread, as been said before. Parents are asking us a lot, what about daycare, school? What does vaccination do for us? Well, once your kids are vaccinated, people can, I don't want to say relax, but they tend to say, okay, we can start doing things. We can bring our kids out. We can have them see the grandparents. They can go to daycare. If they're vaccinated, there's less chance that they're going to get severe disease. Kid can notice back to school. CDC and the recommendations is after 5 days and no fever, if the kid will wear a mask properly, they can go back to school, assuming they test negative, and each school.
Okay, it seems like we lost Dr. Levine. Oh. Eric, are you back?
All right, I'm back. I had a very unstable connection today, and I'm sorry, guys. Where was I? Of course, I can't even see my
Daycare,
slides.
school, and vaccination.
But so wearing, getting vaccinated, we can start to get our kids back to school, back to daycare, and have more normal interactions, play dates, after school activities, and those things. I think the bottom of the slide says something about Omicron. Somebody could just read it to me, please. Yes. I can't see it.
During the last Omicron wave, hospitalizations for children under 5 years of age had similar or increased severity of disease as older kids and teens. And he's gone again. But I think that pretty much speaks to itself. So the next slide, 3 to 6% of children report COVID symptoms for more than 12 weeks, about 3 months post-infection. So we are seeing long-term COVID in children.
Yeah, we're seeing about 6% of kids are reporting long-term symptoms. I'm sorry, I don't see my slides, and I apologize. So we're also, vaccine reduces the risk of MIS-C. What is MIS-C? It's a severe illness, mainly seen in children post-COVID, 4 to 6 weeks, usually post-COVID. And it's characterized by fever, and it can affect hello? Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. I still can't see my slides, but 60 to 70% of the kids require admission to ICU if they get MIS-C, and there's a very small percentage of death, unfortunately. And the vaccines truly reduce this risk. The risk is reduced to 1 in a million versus 1 in 200 if you get the vaccine. And as Rachel has reported, there's been no reports of myocarditis in this age group post-vaccination with either brand. Next slide. The COVID pandemic has really a lot of more indirect impacts on children. There's a lot of mental health and emotional issues. We've seen it in the adolescents, we're seeing it in the younger kids. Lots of socialization issues and a lot of issues with families, and getting the kids vaccinated and getting them back to more normal activities is really important. We've also seen that education gaps, kids who don't go to preschool because their parents are afraid. Now that with vaccination, they can go. It will really help. The other issue is we're keeping their kids in the house, especially the little ones who aren't vaccinated, and they're not getting that outdoor play time. They're spending more time online, playing with their iPads, and we need to get them outside, physical activity, and interacting with other kids. And that will be very important to everybody's mental health, both the children and the parents. Next slide. And I'm done. And I'm sorry, I apologize again for my internet connection.
I think we've learned that slides are important though, because at least somebody else can pick up for you if you can't get through. So, okay, Rachel, some of these questions I think probably are best for you, or we'll start with you and go from there. So you said that mRNA vaccine, the technology is not new, it's been around forever. But isn't this the first vaccine that it was used for? And if that's the case, how do we know how safe it really is?
So that is correct. The COVID-19 vaccines are the first instance of use for this mRNA technology. The thought process and the science on developing mRNA vaccines on a small scale has been moving through, research laboratories for quite some time, and they've been figuring out how to design the RNAs to get them to get into cells and to make proteins. Well, we had to figure out how to design an RNA in order to get spike to make the right antibodies to it. So those studies have been worked on over the past decades. We've kind of had to wait for technology to catch up in order to deploy these vaccines on a wide scale. Companies like Moderna, this is their expertise, is mRNA vaccines, and they've been working on this for many, many years. They're a biotechnology company that's based in Cambridge in Massachusetts, and they've been working on this for a while prior to COVID on other mRNA vaccines for viruses like cytomegalovirus, which is a herpes virus, influenza virus, respiratory syncytial virus. So there's a lot of mRNA vaccines working through the pipeline of many companies, and I'm looking forward to see the results of all these mRNA vaccine trials that are up and coming.
So, people ask about the long-term side effects, right? And, obviously you can't tell the future. And if a vaccine hasn't been around for 20 years, it hasn't been around for 20 years. But given what you know about mRNA, are you concerned that 20 years from now, that there's going to be some side effect that we can't foresee now?
I'm not really concerned. With vaccines, we tend to see any quote unquote long-term effect within about 6 to 8 weeks, and we haven't seen that with these vaccines. I've been a participant in these vaccine trials, in the phase 3 trials. So I volunteered to have myself injected with this RNA before we knew 100% that it was safe and effective, because I had a lot of confidence in RNA.
Thank you. Dr. Kreiner, given what you know about viruses and what we know about COVID vaccine and how it affects the body, do you have any concern that COVID might cause problems down the line?
Well, clinically, and we always want to go based on real world experience. And as an allergist seeing, 300 patients a month, I have seen the complications that COVID has caused prior to vaccine development. I have, patients that have shortness of breath that persist for months. I have those that have fatigue that have persisted for months, tachycardia that's persisted for months. So in real world experience, not even, subjecting myself to these clinical trials, but subjecting myself to my clinic, I have seen the real world long-term COVID side effects from the infection. And we've even seen, people pass away. We've seen family members pass away from the severe illness. And we have seen over the last 2.5, 3 years, the decrease in hospitalization, decrease in deaths with the vaccine development.
Back to, well, I don't know, let's stick with Robin. Would you pick Pfizer or Moderna?
I went where I got a slot when it first opened up. So I went with the one that I chose. I went with Pfizer with my older 2 kids because that was what was available at the time. And being in medicine, being in science and reading up on the studies, I would give honestly whatever's available. And, the studies are pretty comparable. So I don't have a preference at this point in time. And I'm just hoping that parents will choose whatever they feel works they want for their children at this point in time. Moderna or Pfizer, I think both have efficacy at preventing severe illness and complications. So at this point in time, no. My long-winded answer is no, I don't have a preference.
Okay, and I can't help but ask this, did you vaccinate your 3-year-old?
My 3-year-old just had COVID, so I did not vaccinate yet, but he just had it a few weeks ago.
But you plan to?
And to vaccinate my 3-year-old.
So that brings us to another question. Dr. Levine, if somebody's had COVID, A, should they get the vaccine? And B, how long do they have to wait until they get it?
They should absolutely get the vaccine. In one of our previous webinars, Rachel talked about, or maybe it was one of our dinner conversations, talked about making clean antibodies versus dirty antibodies, whereas the vaccine is going to make really good clean antibodies, quote unquote clean. The recommendations is 10 days, as long as you're asymptomatic, 10 days after your diagnosis, you can vaccinate. I will say in practice, most parents are waiting a couple of weeks post-COVID illness to get the vaccine, but I tell them after 10 days.
I think the other point is also, some people are not concerned about COVID because their child got a mild infection, but the more mild the infection, probably the less strong your antibody response is. So another reason to get vaccinated. Rachel, do you have a preference between the two vaccines? And can you talk about the percent of protection after a full series of one versus a full series of the other?
Yeah, so scientifically, I have no preference for either. We think about equal protection after completing the primary series for both of them. So again, that primary series is 3 for Pfizer, 2 for Moderna. So after that's done, about 2 weeks after, I would think there'd be about equal levels of protection. It's why I'm not taking too much stock in the raw efficacy percentages that came out of these trials, more that they induced similar immune responses.
And when you, go ahead.
Yeah. Scientifically, no preference. Moderna, I think, will complete the primary series faster, logistics-wise. So that's one advantage of Moderna over Pfizer is logistics. The child is fully protected faster.
Right. And I can tell you that we've had a lot of kids who got their first dose and then in between dose 1 and 2 ended up getting COVID. So I would imagine that becomes much greater if you're now waiting for dose 3.
Exactly.
When you talked about a booster dose, that would be a 4th dose of Pfizer and a 3rd dose of Moderna?
Yes, for children under 5.
Okay. So can you talk about the number of children that were studied and how that compares to prior studies, like for measles, mumps, rubella? And then Robin, I'm going to ask you, because I know your partner Ralph talks about polio and how that was done. Can you comment on that, Rachel?
Yeah, so these trials included, I'd say, about 5,000 children. We know the adult trials included 40,000 participants. The reason why the children's trials didn't include that many is because they worked on the concept called immunobridging. So they are comparing the immune response from those children to that of the young adults subset of the population where we know they produced an effective immune response. So you don't need, you don't need 40,000 children to necessarily show efficacy there. I'm not familiar off the top of my head with the number of children enrolled in measles vaccine trials or polio vaccine trials. I know polio vaccine trials were probably done many, many years ago.
Even before I was born, I think. Robin, do you know that story though that Ralph tells?
No, I do, and he does it better than I do, but I've been doing these webinars the last 2 years now and always have that in the back of my head. But, he has real world experience regarding the polio vaccine. And we've seen, just as an example, that these vaccinations are not, microchipped. They're not out to get us. They're not followed by Alexa or things like that, but they're to help prevent severe illness, severe complications, and death. And, the studies we've had over these last few decades show that vaccinations work. And we've seen that if we stop vaccinating or we don't vaccinate in a timely fashion, we get these severe outbreaks. As an example, the measles outbreaks that we see in certain pockets of New York. And when you do vaccinate, we see a decrease in those pockets and those complications. So right now we have a little bit more experience with the measles vaccination and outbreaks, but with polio, we've seen almost complete eradication of that based on the continuous adherence to vaccination measures and the studies that we have gathered over the last several years.
Yeah, and one of my takeaways when I heard Ralph was, and this is Dr. Strauss, by the way, of Strauss Allergy and Asthma, that when they did the initial polio studies, the doctor who did it came to the FDA or the CDC or whoever it was back then and said, I'm ready, we need to give this vaccine. And they said, no, you didn't do enough kids. And they made him go back and do an entire summer of more kids and more studies, and thousands of children became paralyzed during that time. So that's always, the what you're weighing, right? How long do you want to continue these studies for versus is it safe enough to get out there? And the concept of immunobridging has allowed us to extrapolate more from the adults to see that it is safe, correct?
Yeah. And you
Okay.
are being in these trials is very, very time consuming. I can say that from firsthand experience. So when you're taking a young child in, essentially for more doctor's visits, it's something that you don't want to do that, but it's necessary. So the fewest number of children that you can include is better and will increase your probability of having everyone in the trial adhere to trial protocols, which will give you better data.
Eric, if somebody's child already had COVID and they did fine, do they really have to worry that the next time the child could get sicker?
Actually, yeah, we just don't know. Each case, you could have had COVID twice, gotten through it with a sniffle, and the third time you could end up in the hospital. We just don't know. The best and safest is to get vaccinated because we know that's going to help prevent severe disease and illness.
And if you have a child who's on the cusp, like turning 5 or turning, 6, would you recommend waiting?
I don't recommend waiting. It gets a little confusing, and parents, I can understand that, because if you get and I actually had this case today. The child had their first dose in my office a couple of weeks ago and was under 5. So they got the under 5 dose. Now the kid is 5. So now needs the over 5 dose. So they were a little hesitant. They didn't understand, but it has nothing to do with weight or size. It is done by age and development. And they figure this out by the development of their immune systems. And they do that. So don't worry about the weight of your child or the size of your child.
Yeah, we get that a lot. He's very big for his age. Do I need to go into the next age?
And I
So-
want to add that Rachel, I love my child, but she's a tiny thing. And she got the same dose as the 350-pound man.
Okay. Rachel, would the vaccine protect from the current dominant strain of BA.5?
So the original formulation does protect against severe illness from, the currently circulating Omicron subvariant. There is reduced efficacy against symptomatic illness. That's why we're seeing a lot more quote unquote breakthrough cases. We're seeing a lot more vaccinated individuals test positive for COVID-19. But the vaccinated individuals that get sick are less likely to become really sick or need to be hospitalized.
So, given how much COVID is around, are we endemic instead of pandemic? And does it really matter in this vaccine discussion?
It doesn't really matter for this vaccine discussion, and drawing this pandemic endemic line is very, very challenging to kind of do as we're in it. It's almost something that's easier to do in hindsight. I like to think about when something reaches endemic point, it's something that's no longer overwhelming the healthcare system. Means we're no longer running out of space or staff in the hospital to care for routine things that would need to be people would need to be hospitalized for. So like strokes, heart attacks, appendectomies, you get into a car accident, things like that. So that if you need care for an emergency, you know that the hospital is not overwhelmed.
Right. And flu has been pandemic and endemic at various points.
Exactly.
Robin, if you have a child that has really bad allergies, are they at a greater risk of getting a reaction to the COVID vaccine?
Oh, nice that you should ask that. So those with allergies, food allergies, latex allergies, peanut allergies, seasonal allergies are not at any increased risk of reacting to the vaccination, similar to other vaccinations. And we have that, again, extrapolated from the adults. We had many adults fearful regarding their food allergies, bee sting allergies, latex allergies, and that does not indicate that you will have a more severe reaction to the COVID vaccine. In fact, we never really even tested to the vaccine components because even if the test was a little positive, those patients actually tolerated the vaccine with no issue. So we were shown that with and without allergies, there was no increased risk of an increased allergic reaction. And if you have further questions regarding that, I'm happy to set up appointments and discuss further about any concerns that might arise or any thoughts about your child being at increased risk. I'm happy to discuss those as well at length.
I know in our office, we've been giving the COVID vaccine for the older children and then the 5 to 11 and now the younger children. And it's almost annoying to have everybody wait for 15 minutes when we've seen no reaction to anything. We still do make everybody wait because those are the recommendations, but we're really not seeing anything. I may have been thinking about something else. I don't know if you said this, Robin. If somebody has a history of anaphylaxis, they do have to wait for 30 minutes, right?
You know, I tell all my patients, if you're scared, you're fearful, just to wait 30 minutes. I always tell my staff as well, the more prepared you are, the less bad things happen. So if that patient feels fearful, if that patient has a history of anaphylaxis, by all means, wait for 30 minutes. And I even tell them to wait in a facility where, you know, epinephrine can be given, and even bring, you know, some Zyrtec or Benadryl or, you know, anything with you in case you feel off or something like that. Because sometimes you get in your head, I'm going to react, and you can almost work yourself up. But I usually tell my patients if they're fearful to wait 30 minutes, and we're happy to have them sit with us.
So you mentioned waiting in a facility that has epinephrine available. Are there places that give the COVID vaccine that don't have epinephrine available? Do you know?
Sometimes they'll get it. I mean, the kids right now are getting it likely in pediatricians' offices, but many were getting it at CVS. They were getting it at, I don't know, Costco maybe, but perhaps there were facilities where they may not have known where the epinephrine was.
Yeah, I think certainly while they may be prepared or have stuff, I would imagine a pharmacist or many pharmacists would be more concerned with anaphylaxis of a child than a pediatrician, you know, just by nature of experience and that kind of stuff. I also know that for children under, like Walgreens isn't doing children under 3 and CVS isn't doing children under 18 months. So for those younger kids, you really end up at the pediatrician. Eric, if somebody's had COVID before, are you finding that their reactions are worse? Is it as if it's like the booster on the first shot? And are you seeing that?
We are not seeing that. I don't know if you are. We are not seeing any difference in reaction, whether they've had COVID before or not. And actually, we've had much less reports of any problems in the under 5 age groups than we did with 5 to 11 or 12 and ups.
Okay, going back to really the adults and then the teenagers, there was this concern about fertility. Rachel, you're nodding. Do you have any information on that, or you just remember it?
There was actually a study that was published this week. Sorry.
Oh, excellent! Breaking news.
Breaking science. So the vaccine does not affect fertility. It doesn't make someone less fertile. This was actually a really large study that was done looking at the effect of the vaccine on a woman's menstrual cycle. And they did find that the vaccine does alter a woman's menstrual cycle, but that's not necessarily something to be concerned with. The vaccine is inducing an immune response. And we know that immune responses and infections, even long haul flights, can alter a woman's menstrual cycle.
Vacations.
Exactly, yeah. So while it is altered, it's not something to necessarily be concerned with.
It's a temporary alter.
Yes, it may be for the most immediate cycle after the vaccine.
Just to add to that, I know a lot of questions, where does it alter your DNA? Does it alter your RNA? And as Rachel and many people have discussed prior, the vaccine or the RNA component does degrade. So, it leaves your body. It does not affect anything or insert into anything or change your genetic makeup, is important to remember.
Eric, for moms who took the vaccine while they were pregnant or the booster and then breastfed, their child is 6 months. Are they protected now? Do they still need the vaccine?
Well, after about 4 months, the antibodies the baby got from the mother's vaccine is probably dissipated. There are studies that show that if you're breastfeeding, you're passing along antibodies, but not enough that's going to be as good as getting that vaccine at 6 months.
Right. I mean, I guess we start the vaccines for other things, right? Polio, pertussis,
Right.
meningitis, when the kid's two months, 4 months, and 6 months, so that they will be done by the time that antibody leaves a baby that they got from their mom. So,
yeah. So I always say, you know what, breastfeed as long as you want. I think it's great. And you are passing along all sorts of wonderful things, but that, like we say, we want to give the other vaccines, pertussis, polio, Prevnar, give the vaccine at 6 months.
and with the fertility, is there any reason, I'll throw this to you, Robin, to think that what's true for the adults isn't true for children, or that it would affect fertility in children?
No, I think, again, extrapolating the real world evidence and studies, it should not affect children's fertility or children's menses or children's puberty or anything like that. I have not seen anything that would come anything close to affecting that aspect of a child's makeup.
Right. I think we have to remember that whole fertility question came up even before the menstrual irregularities from people who were looking to discredit the vaccine, because how do you make people nervous? You tell them it's going to affect something in the future that you can't possibly measure. There really is no reason. And I think it was that the spike protein on your uterus has, similar to the spike protein, in the COVID vaccine, that there's like one thing. But that's, and I've used this analogy before, that's like saying that because, my car has a key and your car has a key, that my car is going to be able to open your car. Like, it just doesn't work that way. And we've been trying to prove a negative ever since. I'd like to postulate that people who get the mRNA vaccine are going to be less likely to get cancer or strokes. Let's throw that out there. We will have no proof, but it's the same as the people who throw out things that may be bad. Why is it that only bad things happen?
Dr. Firestone, I could actually jump in here. I got my initial dose series Pfizer, and I would like to tell you I am 7 months pregnant with a beautiful baby girl. So I am a real world experience.
Very exciting. Okay, Rachel, one more for you. One last thing, I'm going to read it directly. I hadn't considered that the antibody response was the lens for efficacy. Could I please hear again how both vaccines performed in terms of antibody response?
Yeah.
And then a caveat to that is, can I just measure the antibody response in my kid who had COVID and decide if they need the vaccine or not?
Well, I'll start with one, and then I'll move on to measuring your own child's antibody levels.
Okay.
The antibody what we're looking at with the antibody responses in the trials is that are they inducing neutralizing antibodies? So antibodies that bind to spike and facilitate its destruction. Are they producing those antibodies in a similar amount to that of young adults from the adult trials? And for both Pfizer and Moderna, Pfizer after 3 doses, Moderna after 2, the answer is yes. So those children under 5 are making levels of neutralizing antibodies similar to that of young adults. And that's what we think is a prerequisite for a satisfactory immune response to the vaccine. I'm not taking too much stock in the exact efficacy percentages. They're based on the number of the amount of follow-up time after that last dose is done, how many children got sick in there. So I think if we let them all go, for another year or 2, they would all even out to be, a number that's around the same. And then measuring your own antibody responses, no, the answer is no. So the commercially available tests that you would use to measure your antibody levels or serologic testing are not nearly as accurate as the antibody testing that's being done from the serum in the clinical trials. So what's being done to measure these special antibodies called neutralizing antibodies is these children are returning to this clinical trial sites a month, 3 months, 6 months, a year after their last dose, and they're having their blood drawn, standard blood draw, and then that blood is shipped off to the lab, and then they're isolating the serum or the plasma from that blood, and they are mixing that with the virus in a laboratory and asking, okay, does that participant's sera block the virus from getting into a cell and establishing infection? And that's how they're measuring those levels of neutralizing antibodies. So it's highly sophisticated testing that can't be done in a regular commercial testing lab.
So the tests that we can order or that adult doctors order just don't look at the same things?
No, you're not getting nearly the level of information. And I want to highlight while we're at this is that antibodies are not the only determination of protection. They're one of the things that we talk about the most because they're the easiest to measure. There's a lot of other cells like T cells that we know are an important part of the immune response to COVID that we don't measure as frequently because those are even harder to measure.
Okay, we have questions about how to get the vaccine. So different allied sites have different policies as to getting the vaccine based on the availability they have the staff to give it and other things. Someone specifically asked about Valley Stream Pediatrics. I can tell you that Dr. Lashley is the vaccine king. They have been really leading Allied from the beginning in giving vaccine. They have Moderna and Pfizer, and it's very available. They will also vaccinate non-Allied patients, as far as I know, and people from the community. So that's Valley Stream Pediatrics. If anybody is not an Allied and looking for it. If you're interested and you're within Allied, call your own office. They will let you know when they're giving it. I know my office, Pediatric Health Associates in Plainview, we've decided that we're giving Moderna. We picked one vaccine because it was just easier for us and we felt there would be less wastage than having 2. And you can call the office and make an appointment. We are not giving it to people outside of our practice. And again, we wish we could, but it's just, there's so much stuff going on and COVID is still causing staff shortages. Every day, it's whose kid has been exposed and who's out, and it's just really hard to plan these things. Going to Walgreens or CVS or wherever else they seem to have it is fine. If your child is under 18 months, you can't do that. Call your Allied doctor, they'll help you try and figure it out. Or like I said, Valley Stream Pediatrics, it's worth driving to go somewhere and get the vaccine. Does anybody have any closing comments? Well, I'll have you do them anyway. Eric? First of all, I'm so glad your connection strengthened and we can actually see you and hear you.
Yeah, once in a while the internet works here up in the North Country. The most important thing is the vaccine is safe, and we recommend that you get your kids vaccinated 6 months and up. If you're eligible for your booster, please, as parents, get your booster, protect your children. If you're over 50 or immunocompromised, please get your second booster. You need to protect yourself, you need to protect your kids. It's really important. And the best thing is reach out to your allied physician. We will talk to you if you have other questions.
That reminds me, there was a question that I forgot to ask. For children over 5, what's the recommendation now for boosters if they've gotten their 2 Pfizer shots?
There's no recommendation yet for a booster in the 5 to 11-year-olds unless they're immunocompromised or at extremely high risk. I haven't seen anything yet. I don't know if Rachel's read anything recently. She's my go-to information source, but I haven't seen anything yet at this time.
I have
I
not.
thought,
No, right, I'm sorry.
yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's been a long hour here. I'm sorry, yes, 5 to 11, and I'm giving them in the office. I don't even, 5 to 11-year-olds, yes, there's the booster 5 months after the second. I'm thinking 4th, I'm sorry. So yes, I take everything back I said before. Over 5 months after your second dose, you should get the booster. There is a question everybody asks, should I wait for fall? Should I wait for the Omicron booster? No, get the booster.
Okay, and Eric, are you giving vaccine to above 12 at Chester?
We're not giving above 12. Like you said, there's staff shortages, and getting the above 12 is so much easier to get at any local pharmacy. We want to save our resources for the under 5s and the 5 to 11s.
Okay, Dr. Kreiner.
So just want to, reiterate everything, but everyone did a great job presenting to Dr. Levine. So thank you for all that information. And thank you guys all for joining in and participating and, at least listening to what we have to say in the studies. That's the first step. And we hope we've provided some information for you to kind of guide you in your decision. My 9 and 6-year-old, I just boosted a few weeks ago, especially before they went away to camp. It does provide an extra layer of protection for themselves and those around them. And also, family members, grandparents, aunts, uncles, things like that. And again, if you have any questions, I am an allergy immunologist for adult and pediatrics. So if you have any further questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I think that's pretty much all from my end.
Excellent. We will be sending everybody who registered for this, whether you attended or not, a copy of the video so that you can share among your friends. Rachel, any parting words?
I just want to reiterate what has already been said about the importance of vaccination, but I want to highlight that there is so much information and misinformation out there at the realm of our fingertips. So it's very difficult to be inundated with a lot of information, some of it incorrect and some of it correct, and not being sure who to trust. So if you have questions or unsure of anything that you're reading on the internet or hearing from friends or word of mouth, to talk to a source that you trust, whether that's your pediatrician, a healthcare provider, a local scientist. You can reach out to any universities in your area. I'm sure they have virologists that are more than happy to speak to you, to speak to your children's classes once school starts in the fall as well.
Yeah, Rachel, I find what you give to this presentation invaluable because we don't necessarily get the science behind things all the time, and to see it from your eyes and the studies and how supportive you are of this, and you have no reason to be supporting the vaccine if it didn't make sense from a scientific standpoint. So I definitely appreciate seeing that scientific bent. But thank you everybody for attending. Like Rachel said, trusted information. Look at the source where you're getting it. You know, if your mother's friend keeps emailing you articles that are making you crazy, stop reading them. You know, go to our website, talk to your pediatrician. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice night.
Thank you.